is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott, here with co-host Andrew Young. We've got a great guest today, Daniel Lynch, the head of MetaMask Institutional Partnerships at Consensys. For the folks who are listening, we're going to hear a little bit about MetaMask. Many people who are in crypto know MetaMask, obviously. For those who don't, it's integrated into nearly every DeFi application and offers access to over 17,000 protocols within Web3 for everything from trading, staking, lending, borrowing, derivatives, asset management, and you name it. They've got over 30 million monthly active users on the platform, which makes MetaMask far and away the most popular Web3 interface in the world. And access to basically everything EVM. And as we've discussed, that's like 60% of Web3, essentially, maybe probably more than that, actually. But in terms of DeFi and TVL and access to assets and everything, it's a kind of dominant part of the ecosystem. Daniel also runs MetaMask Institutional. That's a really interesting area for us as we talk about Web3 adoption within corporations, within large asset managers, and into the economy as a whole. That is a key gateway for onboarding businesses to the world of Web3. So we're really interested in that topic. And then finally, he also heads up, as if that weren't enough, he also heads up LATAM for Consensys. And so as we've discussed on the show, we view Latin America as one of the core areas within the world for growth in Web3. And as I've reported from the front lines, so to speak, from trips to Bogota and Brazil and Mexico and elsewhere, this is an area where we're really seeing stronger adoption than, frankly, in North America. And I would argue a higher level of knowledge and sophistication within both business and government as well. So, Daniel, there's a ton to sort of bite off and chew here in the time allotted. We hope we can get to all of it. But before we get started, just thank you so much for joining. We're delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you for the invite. Big fan for a long time. I was saying I read the blockchain revolution years ago. I got a copy of your latest tome right here. I highly recommend it, everyone. Read it twice already. Very well researched, very thorough view of the entire ecosystem. So always, I think I knew you when I was still working at Swift, and just seeing you bridge those worlds between institutions and some of the more DeFi native folks. Couldn't be more happy to be here with you today.
Wow, Daniel, you're already Alex's favorite guest we've ever had. It's usually up to him to show the book, so it's
he's not the first to pick up a book and show it, but you're on a short list, so I appreciate that. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. Like my interest has always been actually in trying to bridge the gap between this emerging tech ecosystem and the world of business kind of writ large. And that's taken a lot of different forms. And I think what you're doing was one of the most important, really, tasks in the industry, right? Which is to make Web3 legible and usable and, frankly, not scary for large companies, right? So why don't you just, Daniel, like you mentioned Swift. I mean, a lot of people know what that is. Some people don't. And I think it's a really interesting origin story for someone who's now in the Web3 world. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, yeah. I worked in software for a number of years. I worked at Swift for a while. That's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. It's a network through which most of the payment instructions, as well as a little less advertised. Technically, there's even more messages around security, settlement, and reconciliation on Swift than there are payments. But for payments, security, settlement, and reconciliation, as well as trade finance. I was working there for a while. Before that, I worked in supply chain software, and being a person interested in software, having some friends with it. Actually, it has nothing to do with being in software. These people incidentally are in software, but this is chance. Some friends I knew from high school, one of them moved to San Fran, and he came back to have a party around his wedding, and his parents had moved to Staten Island. And if you know New York, you have to take a boat there. And had a lot of time to talk with another friend catching up as we were going to his parents' new house. This is 2012. And he's telling me all about this Bitcoin. I should look into Bitcoin, check out Bitcoin. And he was a really sharp guy. I got home the next day, I guess, after the wedding, and I started reading a little. I bought maybe 2 or 3 Bitcoin for, I don't know, $8 or something like that. So again, I was very interested in Bitcoin at this point, but I wasn't sold as it was like a panacea to all the problems that could replace the entire banking sector. I mean, banking's a lot more than transfer of value. There is, of course, lending and securities markets, et cetera, corporate cash management. But my interest was piqued. And at the time, I downloaded one of those apps, not even a graph. It was just a Bitcoin price ticker. And I would just look at my phone. Oh, no, it's $200 now. That's interesting. And I would do that from time to time. I would follow up the news. The Mt. Gox scandal was quite interesting. I learned the value of, I think, private keys then. I was working in cryptography a little at work, but I had to recover these keys to like sell some Bitcoin when it was like 300 that I had on like a Dell netbook somewhere that wasn't working anymore. But ultimately, again, fascinated by the project. I thought it was cool. But what really turned me on was in 2015, I was working at Swift. I was just going to a few events in the fintech financial industry, and Consensys and BlackRock, I believe, sponsored a workshop on how to program smart contracts in Solidity. This was maybe September or October of 2015. And having worked in supply chain, having worked in payments, having worked in securities settlement, I was fascinated by Ethereum immediately. I started to try to get Consensys. I started to try to get Swift to do things on Ethereum. And at that time, that meant by de facto working with Consensys. It was pretty much the only company in the industry. So I made a lot of friends there, brought them to Swift. And then over the years, just decided to make the jump. A friend tried to get me to join Consensys in 2017 or 18, I can't remember. And I did not take that opportunity, but I did in 2021. And here we are today.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, I mean, so Consensys, for people who are listening and who may not know, when Ethereum was launched, basically Consensys was this entity that helped to incubate and develop and really kind of give a job to people who wanted to do cool stuff in the Ethereum ecosystem as a way to sort of help to bootstrap the ecosystem to prime the pump, I think, right? To give a place where I think projects could kind of congregate, get funded and develop. And, today it's developed a lot of things, and it's sort of like the power law of like VC investing where, some of those things have worked out. Some of those things have not. And then some have become massive, like MetaMask. And MetaMask is like this thing that is, one of the 5 or 7 most important entities in Web3, I think. I don't know. I use 5 to 7. You can probably guess what the 5 to 7 might be. I would include like Bitcoin and Ethereum in that list. So you're in good company. So talk a little bit about like the MetaMask story specifically, right? How did MetaMask get started? Where is it today? And then we'll get to the future, but then where does the institutional part fit into that?
Surely. So I think a lot of people think of MetaMask as a wallet, right? It's one of these wallet extensions that you can use to connect to dApps or decentralized applications and commit different operations. I think from its inception, the folks at Consensys and MetaMask being a company within Consensys or a brand within Consensys, have always had a little bit of a different vision. I think the phrase we use sometimes internally is that it's a tool for exercising your digital authority. So while a lot of people talk about financial applications, we can talk about DeFi today. We can talk about how really, I think already people say there's no use for crypto. Remittances, I think we already have a killer application that is being used in massive volume by people. So certainly there is a financial element, but we've always had a broader remit in the MetaMask team and at Consensys, and that we want to kind of re-envision how folks interact digitally. So of course there's like Web 1 you've read the Chris Dixon thing, I'm sure some of the audience, where you can like write data, or you can read data rather, and then read write is Web 2, Web 3 is read write. People say own, but I think, the owning is just a mechanism. It's not really about how much you own. It's about really truly creating an internet where folks have agency. So whether that means like a social media network where perhaps the likes are like micro payments, and perhaps those payments could represent like a democratic participation in a platform. I could imagine how the evolution of Twitter would have been very different if that was the model of both the economic model as well as the governance, as well as it could mean, again, maybe, a platform. You think of these two-sided platforms, really creating like a two-sided market where there really isn't a middleman. So maybe a better way of sharing music or ordering a cab. So just to be clear for us, MetaMask has always existed as a way to manage your digital authority across these different verticals. And while we talk a lot about finance, we really see it as a much more liberatory concept. Now, it started as simply an extension in your browser. So some of the audience maybe knows this already, some maybe more from the TradFi world. But essentially, it is like your single sign-on. For those that don't know, when you single sign on with Google or with another account onto Seamless to order a delivery or so that you can order an Uber, but you are controlling your own private keys. And it is a fundamental, I would say, piece of the infrastructure or the market infrastructure of DeFi, because it allows you to interact with these dApps. And I say DeFi, but again, there are dApps that they don't necessarily have to do with anything financial. You may have heard of like XMTP is an attempt at creating a decentralized like WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram where you are messaging people based on the keys you own. So for a long time, MetaMask and some of the other wallets that compete with it have existed as this wallet extension that allows you to then sign on to these decentralized applications and interact with them, whether that's making a loan into a decentralized lending pool, or whether that's signing onto this XMTP to send a message to your friend. I was using one of the social networks that I mentioned. I don't think it exists anymore, but there was one called Sent that actually had this model where you would post and your budget of likes was essentially based on how many people liked your post, which I think is a cool model. It means good posters get rewarded. But I had signed on to that back in like 2018 using MetaMask, and I really enjoyed it. So again, it is this way of exercising digital authority. Now, it is an extension that you use to sign on to these properties, but we do think a lot about usefulness and utility for everyday people. The extension has to work, right? It's an essential piece of infrastructure for DeFi. So while other people try to innovate at the extension level, and we certainly do, we've added a lot of cool stuff around security. We do think about other pieces of real estate that we can innovate with. So if folks are aware of the portfolio.metamask.io is our portfolio experience, this is where we're really trying to have the extension still work for executing signatures with these different properties. But within the portfolio dApp is really where we're trying to create an experience where, whether it's your first day in Web3 or your 50th, we're really giving you a significantly simplified experience, something that approximates or even passes that of using a custodial platform, but where you retain these keys that give you agency in this digital world. So there we have, a swap aggregator that lets you swap assets across all the dexes. We have the bridge aggregator, I think is very important. That's been very big the past month with the rise of a lot of these networks. Certainly Linea, our network's been getting a lot of use, but you do see things like Base, which I have to applaud, and there's Arbitrum, Optimism, Blast, ZK Sync, etc. Our bridge tool has made it increasingly easy and secure and intuitive for folks to move assets across these chains. We have the most on and off ramps. Today, this is great timing because we just made some announcements in Dubai. We announced that we are integrating exchange data, so you can also see your balances from the likes of Coinbase and Binance.
Oh, cool.
And so again, a really thoroughly intuitive experience, because we want people to exercise the digital authority, but not just the OGs or the people who are super into cryptography, but we think everyday people should get to participate in this better internet.
So that's
go ahead.
No, that's really interesting. And I think I was looking at the stats. MetaMask Swap, I believe, is now one of the biggest DEX sort of interfaces, or whatever you want to call it, just in terms of users. And I've always been a huge fan. That was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, when you guys added, maybe even longer actually, when you added fiat onboarding directly into MetaMask. I thought that was a huge sort of step forward for the whole Web3 space. What other functionality are you guys kind of excited about? I mean, without giving too much away, is there a future where you can, maybe not leverage trade, but you can take out loans, do staking? Actually, I think there is staking built into MetaMask as well.
It's very funny you bring this up. This is such good timing, because another announcement that we just made is actually about this adapter standard. I've been working on this. This stretches across MetaMask and MetaMask Institutional. But if you have ever heard of Lex Sokolin, he was our chief economist for a while at Consensys, as well as excellent. Loves.
I interviewed him for the book. These things get mixed.
No, we had Lex. We had Lex on the podcast too.
We had Lex. Okay, we did have Lex. Probably both.
Excellent. So Lex was our chief economist and chief tokenomist, if I said that right. It's a new word to try to pronounce. But I was really impressed with Lex around 2018, 2019. He was going to a lot of conferences, and he had this kind of critique of fintech in that they were creating really slick like UX. And essentially every industry has manufacturing and distribution. So you can manufacture a car and you can innovate there, or you can innovate on how you sell cars, right? You can manufacture lipstick, you can innovate in how you sell lipstick, right? This is true of all products. When it comes to finance, a lot of these fintechs were creating sleeker models of distribution at the UX level, but the manufacturing was still the traditional bank rails. And he thought a lot of these fintech projects would not necessarily, reach their full potential. And I think we see that today with some of the IPOs, consolidation, et cetera. DeFi is the complete opposite, right? So it is totally novel. They have totally revolutionized the manufacturing of financial products. So if you think about like, if there's someone doesn't know yet, there are these things called lending pools, right? And you can just post collateral and get a loan out in, say, a stable coin. That is totally novel, right? Because you don't have like counterparty risk. You just have systemic risk. There's not a specific counterparty that can fail.
Well,
And also,
you're swapping counterparty risk for contract risk.
Yeah, exactly. But frankly, the entire financial industry has a systemic risk too, right? So that there's not more risk. You've just eliminated the counterparty risk. You have systemic risk in DeFi, you have systemic risk in banking. It's eliminated the counterparty and systemic, just the systemic, right, at the contract level. And also, if you're like the lendee, you can get this without like a credit history or having to go through a lot of like onboarding with a financial institution. That's amazing. But essentially, the interface for dealing with all these, like I said, you have to log in with the MetaMask extension or another wallet. It feels tough, right? So if we're thinking about like newbies, right? For them, it's a little intimidating. For folks that maybe want to do like high frequency or algorithmic things, they would prefer like a programmatic access. And then when it comes to reading information from them, it's quite, so there's two things when it comes to distributions, like reading and writing, right? So the writing is quite hard. You got to log in with an extension. You have to interact with all of them. And then the reading is like, I can make all these DeFi investments. Most people, no matter how smart they are, they could have an accounting degree. If they have 5 to 6 DeFi investments and you ask them what like their P&L is today, there's no way they could tell you. Most, if you gave them a day to go home and play with spreadsheets, still could not. So we developed a standard for kind of improving this reading and writing process. And we've been working with many of these protocols, Ondos Flux and Angle and Morpho and Lido, to create these read and write adapters such that we can abstract away from like interacting just through dApps, which also lessens the surface attack area. We've seen DeFi protocols that are quite secure, but there's some type of like front end dApp attack, but then also just makes it easier for people or makes it easier for institutions. So we've built better said, the projects themselves have built these adapters using our framework, and the MetaMask institutional users have been using them for about a month or two, or a few months in our portfolio GUI, which I can explain later. As well as over APIs. But today we announced at Token Dubai that we're releasing these APIs for third-party consumption. So if you're like a fund admin who needs to like calculate NAV, if you're an accountant, if you're another wallet, you can consume these APIs. And I think it's going to help the institutions a lot. Also, as we do the write adapters, they'll be able to interact programmatically with these projects. Important in two ways. Like if you're an exchange or a bank or a fintech that wants to like structure these offerings, you can have event-based things. So if a user wants to make a loan in one of these DeFi protocols, it's very easy in your interface. You can make it very intuitive. And then on the read side, you can calculate all this P&L and such. So we announced that third-party consumption of the APIs today. And probably by the end of this month, we will start to at least have those read APIs live in that MetaMask portfolio that's available to our 100 million users, our 33 or 34 million monthly active users. So really, it's a framework that stretches across institutional and retail, but we really want to fix those issues of reading and writing, because again, we've done the manufacture. We, as an industry, not just Consensys, have done really novel and interesting things in the manufacturing of financial products. Now the question is how to thoughtfully approach distribution such that both like your grandpa and also the world's largest fund admin and the world's largest bank can all access these things as well.
Yeah, I love that. Your description of the differences between fintech and DeFi reminded me of an analogy that we used in Blockchain Revolution, which was that fintech is kind of like digital wallpaper, right? It is the sleek interface that makes the industry more appealing and maybe perhaps easier to, use. But underneath the surface, the building is still the same, the plumbing is still the same, the wiring is still the same, and it isn't actually impacting like the deep structure. And DeFi, for all of its, quirks, is trying to reimagine the industry from like what it does, lending money, moving money, storing money, like, accessing credit, investments, and so forth. And I think that, that's just so fascinating that like what what's needed is a bridge of sorts for people to access that world, right? So Andrew, I'm sure you've got other questions, but I mean, I can hop in, but I'd like to hear what you've got, what you'd like to ask.
Yeah, no, totally. I think like one of my biggest questions, obviously, Daniel, because you sort of head up the institutional arm of MetaMask, which I think for me, I usually think of MetaMask as kind of like a consumer tool in a lot of ways, or like a developer tool. And the sort of institutions typically use more like, like centralized exchanges, it's like Coinbase institutional, things like that. So I am curious to hear, like, what's the strategy to get sort of institutions into the on-chain world, where they would obviously, use MetaMask or other different types of wallets.
Surely. Well, really quickly, I don't want to insult my colleague who's incredibly intelligent and amazing. Johan Bornman runs MetaMask Institutional. I run our partnerships, and I'll get into that a little bit because it is a key part of it. But he runs the MetaMask Institutional product. Essentially, all right, so circular definition, MetaMask Institutional is MetaMask for institutions. Boring answer. But what does that mean, right? So basically, like, MetaMask has, as you mentioned, significant reach into these different DeFi protocols, right? But what institutions need is really, I like to think of like three things, right? So number one is they need the additional features, functions, et cetera, that are essential for an institution. So that usually means like not just trading from a hardware wallet or a hot wallet. That's where your keys are just in the extension for those in the audience that maybe have not done this before. They need much more secure policy setting and just a policies of approvals and segregation of these different accounts according to like business lines. So they usually use a custodian, right? So there's different types of custodians. You can work with someone who's like SEC or FCA regulated. You can work with what's known as an MPC tech provider, where essentially you're still retaining custody, but it looks and feels like working with a third party. You can work with a smart contract wallet. In many cases, a lot of these folks work with more than one, because in the traditional world, like, people don't just work with Northern Trust. They work with Northern Trust and JP Morgan and Citi and Bank of New York and State Street, the big custodians. Crypto can be even more complex. So often you find folks using a combination of a qualified custodian like BitGo, an MPC tech provider like Fireblocks, a smart contract wallet like Safe. And what we do is we aggregate those such that you can trade using MetaMask, but from those accounts. So one account can have 2 out of 3 approvers at Fireblocks. Another can have 3 out of 4 approvers at BitGo. One can be 2 out of 3, no approvers from some MPC vault, but they can have whitelisted that contract is only allowed to deposit USDC into Aave, right? So we have that custodial protection. We have this fantastic portfolio management because we are the single win. But we launched 2 years ago. It surprises me, 2.5. That we were the first multi-custodial solution. We're still the only one. A lot of the custodians offer wallets, but there's no one else that's offering this multi-custody experience. So we're very proud of that. And it really impacts like portfolio management and reporting, because if you're using a combination of hot wallets, hardware devices, Fireblocks, BitGo, HexTrust, Safe, we give you a single window and all that. And with those DeFi adapters I mentioned before, we show you your precise P&L on yield farming, liquid staking, et cetera, right? So portfolio management is another thing we layer in there. And then anti-fraud reporting, compliance, we have a number of things there for folks. Additionally, I think we solved this many-to-one, one-to-many integration issue, which like Swift solved back in the day. Banks don't all do one-off integrations with each other. They connect to this single window and those things integrate with each other. So because we're MetaMask, we have connectivity in all these dApps, and such that a custodian doesn't have to worry about that part, right? So we can trade from those custodial accounts and reach all those dApps. We have a staking marketplace with like best-in-class 32 ETH staking enterprise providers like Figment and Allnodes and Kiln and Blockdaemon and our own consensus staking. And folks don't have to worry whether those are individually integrated with each custodian. So we provide, I think, those two things, really parity with MetaMask, additional institutional features, and solving for that one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-one, one-to-many. But to your question of who uses it, probably about 7 types of users today I think of. We have funds, and that can mean crypto funds, and those can be like 3 guys in Miami with an LLC and like $8 million under management, up to like some of the biggest market makers in the world and, big crypto desks. We have increasingly a number of family offices that are getting involved with us and like traditional hedge funds, small piece of their portfolio. But to your point before, they can use an exchange to like buy, sell, hold ETH. But if they want to take part in staking or lending, we can help them do that in a very structured fashion. Number 3, we have venture capitalists. So those that have liquid treasuries from their investments to manage, we help them manage those. They can deploy them in DeFi, which is great. Imagine, you have a 10-year directional bet on a project. Normally, you just got to kind of sit and wait. But you could lend those today in lending protocol. So you're still sticking by the project. You will keep the tokens for 10 years, but at least you can pick up like 3% yield annually in a very easy way. We have DAOs and foundations. So all these protocols that launch, they usually have their own token treasuries to manage. Or you just think of just other DAOs that are not protocol related. They get treasury. People join the Friends with Benefits DAO, or I'm not saying that they're using MMI, but just as an example, when you join, you do buy like an NFT to get you in. They have treasuries to manage, so we help them. As we're kind of climbing up the line of the more institution cases. This is where I think we start to hit like corporates, kind of vanilla corporates that are doing loyalty stuff. Like they have to mint like NFTs that represent tickets or loyalty programs. Well, they have to manage those. So we help them with that like hierarchical wallet management we have in our portfolio or our reporting APIs, so that if you are a big holding company, you can imagine that like, Pepsi Frito-Lay owns more than just Pepsi and Frito-Lay, or Unilever. Not saying they're using MMI, but these are good examples because Unilever has like Gillette or that's Procter & Gamble. They have Gillette, they have Dove soap, etc. So they have to manage these different NFT collections. They get treasuries like USDC or an ETH for their sales. They also do a bit of domain squatting, old school, like it's 2001. They got to buy like, mybrand.lens so that someone else doesn't like log on and say, I hate Toronto, because that would be bad for the brand and also be wrong because Toronto's amazing, as I love the place. And then as we get into the more bank style ones, we have a lot of fintechs and exchanges and some banks in some jurisdictions. We're starting to see this in Brazil, Argentina, I see it, where they create like a structured DeFi offering for their underlying customers. So ETH staking is an easy one, but I know a great fintech in LATAM that offers like, to get a USD account is not impossible in a lot of these countries, but you got to be rich. If you're underbanked, it's very hard. And this one offers like USDC put into Aave. They nakedly say, this is what we're doing. But for the user, they don't have to send keys or gas or any of these concepts. Simply, they have a trading desk that does it for the underlying user. So folks that are not necessarily even middle class can have a yield-bearing USD account, which is quite nice. So thinking about structuring products for underlying customers. And then we have some banks that do the traditional stuff. So like if you want to do a POC at your bank and you want to do like DVP, delivery versus payment of securities versus cash, and institutions like JP Morgan and Santander have done significant work. They understand what like the Geth client is or whatever, or Besu, to submit a transaction to mainnet. They've integrated their key management to their existing HSM infrastructure. They use nodes as a service like our Infura product. Many banks have not put in that investment. But if you want to create a token that represents GE stock and a token that represents US dollar, and then have those swapped between your, an address that represents your correspondent banking division and one that represents your custody or asset management, it's very easy with us to at least set up that infrastructure and reporting that you can do it like in a week. So you only need to understand some things about blockchain, but you don't have to be like a blockchain engineer or have a big team to do that. So folks use us for things like that, tokenized payments, POCs, et cetera. So that was a long answer, but that's the ecosystem across kind of the different types and how it gets more into like institutional kind of examples that someone who's not in DeFi might understand.
Okay, okay. I just want to say like each of those 7 categories is an episode of DeFi Decode. Like I would love to understand like Unilever's Web3 strategy. How does that actually get implemented? Like, how exactly does it, like as you just described, You got NFTs, part of some promotional activity, or a token for loyalty points, or God knows what. Like, there's all this integration that needs to happen on the back end. But I'll park all those for a second because I want to drill down on two, and I'm sure Andrew's got ones that he wants to focus on. But like Jamie Dimon, most people who follow this sort of casually will say JP Morgan hates crypto because Jamie Dimon talks about Bitcoin being worthless. But what you just described was basically the opposite, which is that JP Morgan, more than any other financial firm, TradFi financial firm, understands at a deeply technical level how blockchains networks work and the related primitives as part of their strategy to like focus on those, right? I mean, is that fair based on what you just said?
I would not comment on Jamie's way smarter than me. I'm not going to try to explain any of his. He had a great shareholder letter this week as well, by the way, if you've read it. But I will say there are certain banks that have recognized that like these networks are like public goods that do certain things. So they're networks, right? You don't have to be trading some weird coin on them. They essentially just provide like intra and inter-organization reconciliation. So you're not trying to, whether you're two different orgs, like they say it's about like decentralized trust. And a lot of people think trust is like, oh, if I use a smart contract, the other person's not going to rob me. Okay. The banks don't necessarily think the other bank is going to rob them. What they think is like, what they don't trust is that all these databases are synchronized correctly, right? So you're sending all these SWIFT messages. The biggest SWIFT message used today is like, I think it's called a 578. I forget now, it's been a few years, but it's just a status message when two custodians have a different set of data in their databases about the status of a securities settlement and reconciliation. So I will say, I think folks like JP Morgan, UBS, SocGen, BTG in Brazil, Santander, I don't want to leave out any of these other really, DBS, have been really thoughtful in, because you can offer crypto, and some do, like BTG has their own exchange called Mint in Brazil. They have a stable coin, the BTG dollar, that's on Polygon. So you can do very crypto native stuff, but also you can do things that have nothing to do with what people think of as crypto. But yes, leverage these networks for this type of very difficult intra and inter. And if you're as big as JP Morgan or Santander, it's not just different organizations' databases. You have different business lines with their own databases and legacy banking systems, core banking, order management. So they've recognized that these networks are incredible for having this one single source of truth of the status of a transaction. So that takes care of a lot of the inter and intra-organizational reconciliation, and also for settlement. So there's not a lot of clarity on whether you can use crypto assets in certain markets, but if you tokenize a deposit or a bond, there is some degree of clarity there, right? And you do see exciting things like DTCC, which is the CSD, Central Securities Depository for the United States, has done interesting work to this effect too. So you can do crypto stuff on these networks. You can do not so. I mean, I mentioned before, the XMTP is like decentralized WhatsApp. That has nothing to do with buying and selling Bitcoin. By the same token, no pun intended, I think some of these very intelligent banks have taken a way. They're taking the approach that they want to improve on some of these very hard settlement and reconciliation questions by using this single ledger to advance that goal.
Right on.
Well, yeah, sorry. I also wanted to ask, I mean, I think like one of the things we talk a lot about on this podcast is about how we're seeing an explosion in new chains. And I think it was really cool to see Consensys launch, Linea, which is kind of like its own L2. And now kind of like recently we're starting to see, this whole thing around like Bitcoin, EVM, L2s. I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you guys think about your sort of like multi-chain / cross-chain strategy? Is there stuff you guys do to like, is there certain ecosystems you're really maybe not bullish on, but you're sort of integrating with more? Or is there maybe some ecosystems that like institutions are playing around more in beyond Ethereum? I know, like, for example, there's a lot of stuff around like Polygon, I guess a couple of years ago. I'm just kind of curious how you guys think about sort of the multi-chain explosion.
Sure. So we have a decent amount of conviction in Ethereum, and that, Joe, our CEO and founder, was one of the founders of Ethereum. EVM in general seems to be a standard that has legs. both in like the DeFi world, but then also through folks like the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and the folks using the Besu and Go Quorum clients like JP Morgan and Citi and the good folks at Ernst & Young doing great work. We do have a belief that EVM will be successful. We also have a belief in a multi-chain future that EVM will not be the only network or the only type of network, and Ethereum won't be the only network of the EVMs. So for a long time, MetaMask always supports out of the box all of the EVMs. So if you want to connect to Polygon, Avalanche, if you want to connect to layer 2s like Base and Optimism and Arbitrum and ZK Sync, you could always do that. We do have this belief, though, that you will have to connect to others. So it depends on. In MetaMask Institutional, we already have some of those cool reporting features I mentioned. We support Solana, and we'll be supporting Cosmos probably in the next week. On the MetaMask retail side and MetaMask Institutional, because they have parity, this is not just for networks, but the portfolio dApp is the place where we build. I said we have real estate to build things there, right? That you can use the extension for execution, but like the experience for the user is there when we want to build something. But we also want to let third parties build things. So we launched a kind of marketplace for what we call Snaps was it May or March? I don't know. They both start with M, and it's been a busy year. But essentially, it's a place where folks can develop third-party snaps that you can add to MetaMask. Now, some of these are for like security. I use the Wallet Guard Tenderly ones. I install them, and it gives me a warning before I interact with the dApp that it may or may not have been compromised. But many are around interoperability, right? So we have Solana snaps, Cosmos snaps, Bitcoin snaps, Aptos snaps, Litecoin snaps, etc. If you go to snaps.metamask.io, you can shop around there, and it allows you to derive a key for that network from your EVM key, such that you can interact with them. I use the Soulflare snap a lot. It's one of our popular Solana snaps. I think it has, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, it has a lot of users every day, and I've been quite pleased with it. So Soulflare is already, of course, an offering that exists independently, but this brings this experience into MetaMask. So the snaps has been a significant part of accelerating that. So in the portfolio dApp, we do want to look at ways that we can have more multi-chain support, of course, and with the extension. But the snaps is a great way for us to plug into this ecosystem, much like any type of software ecosystem. It's Steve Ballmer shouting developers back in the day. Maybe I'm a little less sweaty today, but I love that speech. I love coming out to Gloria Estefan. Or it's the big explosion in like the mid 2010s or the early 2010s with mobile applications. You can't build it all yourself, right? So we're really proud of the work we've done there, wherein essentially by installing the snap, you do get this connectivity. So there's a few things there. It's what can we do natively, but what can we do to work with those protocol teams to build those snaps and to certainly support this kind of multi-chain future. Yeah. And then, of course, the bridging tool, if you got to move around, makes it quite easy. Yeah. So
through the MetaMask plugin, you're going to be able to access the whole Solana and Cosmos ecosystem. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a few of them. So you have even competition amongst them. So I think we have a few Cosmos snaps. The idea is that we want to move to a place, by the way, where I think the snaps are still in beta. So it's still beta. So you should, be careful, do a little bit of research. But that said, we want to move to a place where it's totally open and you can just publish a snap. To date, we do audit all the snaps and we go through an onboarding process with them. So they are all quite good. So you can choose from, some only have one snap, but there's like an Algorand snap, there's a Sui snap, but there are, I think there's 2 or 3 Solana snaps and there's 2 or 3 Cosmos. Some of them, I think Shapeshift we worked with, they provide all of the Bitcoin derivatives, so Bitcoin, Dogecoin, Litecoin within the same snap. But you do have some choice there. I like the Soulflare one for Solana, but someone might like another one, so there is some choice there. But you essentially do have support for dozens of networks now from MetaMask, non-EVM.
Yeah, awesome. So just in the interest of time, I do want to pivot a little bit to your other role. So I can't believe that you do these 2 different things, but basically like building up MetaMask Institutional and then also the LATAM piece of it. So, you alluded to it a little bit about how some banks in the region are integrating into DeFi to offer customers, US dollar financial products that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. That is a very interesting opportunity. We've talked a lot about that on the show, the idea that what people really want is a US dollar bank account. And if they can also get access to related financial services like yield on dollars, then God, that's like sort of the holy grail, right? So can you talk a little bit about your role at Consensys opening up this market, and also what's the state of Web3 in LATAM today?
Yeah, so I don't want to think of so I do the business development for LATAM, but just to be clear, like we're a remote first company largely. We have an office in Brooklyn, we got one in UK and Paris, but we have folks distributed everywhere. So we have many folks in LATAM. Their role may not be specific to LATAM, but like the person who launched that MetaMask bridge aggregator lives in Rio. We have a big support team in Colombia. We've got folks in all our second in command of PR lives in Mexico. So we have a strong LATAM presence. But in terms of like partnerships and stuff, public speaking, I do try to represent Linea, MetaMask Institutional with different folks because it's just one thing. I probably would have done it anyways because every job I've had, I usually end up doing. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and most companies, if you speak English and Spanish or English and Portuguese, they say, cool, you get the continent. If you only speak one, it's okay. You're on the LATAM team, you're on the North America team. If you speak them both, you're like, oh, you're Americas, and they just pop an S on it. So I was doing that for Swift. I did that in supply chain. But at Consensys, it's really been a blessing because like just LATAM is it's where it's at for me. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Southeast Asia and the Middle East too. And I don't want to take away from Europe, et cetera. But Latin America has this confluence of factors that make it incredibly interesting for this. So like very young population that's very digitally native. The smartphone penetration is very high. Folks feel very comfortable using a lot of these tools online. A lot of social networks. When Blue Sky was competing with Twitter, the first big non-US community was Brazil. People were just jumping in. It was easy to half the posts in your timeline would be in Portuguese if you're looking for them. So you have that element. You secondly have, as I said, remittances. I think there's a few killer applications in crypto now that are real with mass. But for like 10 years, remittance alone, you could say makes crypto worthwhile. It's been true since like 2014, 2015 that people were doing it pretty massively, even with Bitcoin or Stellar, XRP, whatever. And then obviously with these stable coins and the cheapness or the inexpensiveness of L2s, now we see a ton of it. So the way it facilitates remittances is another big factor. Number three, it's not true across every country, but there have been issues with inflation in some countries where folks want to have an asset that they can hold. I mean, even in the bear market, in certain countries, ETH and Bitcoin were hitting all-time highs like last year because relative to, the inflation that was happening in their currency was at the highest. And then also, I don't want to throw all these banks under the bus. Some of these banks are MetaMask institutional users. I love them. And just and there are even independent of MMI. I've worked with some amazing banks in my Swift and other eras. Like I think Bancolombia, Itaú were always very innovative in the region. But statistically, I used to read this McKinsey report every year at Swift that tried to quantify the rent seeking of banks.
Yeah.
And it was like Asia had high and then they dropped off when they had to start competing with like WeChat and all that, right? US is okay sometimes just because, US has like 6,000 banks. We're very weird and not weird, but like a lot of like old post offices became banks, I think is the origin story. So we have big banks like JP Morgan, but it's not very hard to find a community bank or a credit union. So there's a bit of competition. Europe, there's a lot of regulations around open banking. So, they go up and down. Asia was higher, but dropped. LATAM has always been orders of magnitude higher outside of there's some good banks I named, but generally there's like a lot Canada. Of rent seeking. Yeah. Well, I didn't say that, but yeah.
Canadians pay $700 a year in bank fees, which is the highest, I think, in the world. Obviously, like we make a lot more money than people make in LATAM. So maybe as a percentage in LATAM, it's higher, but like in terms of just dollar figure, it's the highest anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think also helpful is that in certain markets, such as in Brazil, they passed a legislative package that did a number of things. It gave a framework for paying with digital assets as a method of payment. It allowed institutions like exchanges and stablecoin companies to access the payment system directly, much like UK did for fintechs with their faster payments sandbox a number of years ago, as well as gave rules around custody and for investment managers to access these assets. So in addition to these just needs the population has, I think that has created a bit of an explosion of institutional interest there. And as I understand it, I think Petro in Colombia is looking at that legislation to emulate it. And I think maybe Peru as well. So we could see both this kind of demand-based interest in these assets, as well as just a great framework for not just self-custodial wallets or exchanges to interact, but also, larger institutions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating what's going on in the region. And I'm going to tell my children this, that if they learn Portuguese and Spanish, that they can get a whole continent, a whole hemisphere, it seems, to themselves, which is pretty cool. But by then, I'm sure there will be Brazilians and other Spanish-speaking Latin Americans who will feel the same way about Canada. But Daniel, this has been a really amazing conversation. We could go on, as I said, like we could break it down by customer type, by product type, and then dig deeper on the region. But for now, I think that gives our listeners a really great sense of MetaMask as an organization, and also what you're trying to do with the institutional side. So thank you very much. That's it for this week's episode of DeFi Decoded. We'll be back next week and the week after, and really all the way into the summer with some great guests. So please stick with us. Also, please rate and review the podcast and give us a follow wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps new listeners find us, and we're always looking to broaden our reach. So that's it. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you so much.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.